My name is Gerald Marsh, and I was 63 years old the evening my mother looked across the dining room table and told me that this family had always worked better without me in it. The house on Calloway Street smelled the way it always had: pot roast and old carpet, and the particular dampness that came from a basement that had flooded twice and never fully dried. The dining room light was the same fixture my father had installed in 1987, a brass chandelier with 4 bulbs, and 2 of them had been burned out for as long as I could remember. Nobody had replaced them. That detail, for some reason, is the one that stayed with me after everything else. My brother Raymond sat at the head of the table and said nothing. He didn't need to. And here is what none of them knew that night. My father had known exactly who his son was, and he had planned for it. Welcome back to Channel, where quiet patience always outlasts loud cruelty. If you've ever been the one who gave everything and watched someone else receive the credit, this story is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My father's name was Edmund Marsh. He worked as a civil engineer for the city of Harefield, Ohio for 31 years, retiring at 64 with a pension and a handshake and a framed certificate that hung in the downstairs hallway until the day he died. My mother, Lorraine, had been a school secretary at Harefield Elementary for 22 years. They were not wealthy people. They were careful people. There is a difference, and I learned it young. I am the older of 2 sons. Raymond was born 4 years after me, in October 1965, and from the moment he arrived, I understood, without anyone saying it plainly, that something had shifted in the weight of that house. My mother lit up differently when Raymond cried. My father laughed more readily when Raymond spoke. I do not say this to sound like a man who spent his life cataloging grievances. I say it because it is true, and because the truth of it shaped every decision I made for the next 4 decades, and because without understanding it, nothing that follows makes any sense. I grew up on Calloway Street. The house was a 2-story colonial with white aluminum siding, and a driveway that buckled at the far end where a tree root had pushed through the asphalt sometime in the late 70s. My father never fixed it. I learned to ride my bicycle around the buckle, then to drive around it, then eventually to simply navigate the world the same way, around the things that didn't get fixed, without making a scene about it. I left Harefield at 22 for Columbus, where I took a position as a junior draftsman at a structural engineering firm called Keswick and Holt. I worked there for 11 years, then moved to Baxter Engineering Associates in 1998, where I spent the next 22 years as a senior project engineer. I retired at 62, 18 months before the night at the dining room table. I had earned my retirement. I had also earned every year that preceded it. My wife, Carol, died in November of 2019. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of that year and was gone 8 months later. She was 59. We had been married for 31 years. I am not going to spend time on that here because Carol deserves more than a paragraph in this kind of story, and because what she left me, what she reinforced in me during those last months, is something I will describe later at the moment it matters most. Raymond, by contrast, had never left Harefield. He had worked in sales at a regional plumbing supply company for most of his adult life, risen to regional manager by his early 40s, and had lived 4 blocks from my parents' house for 30 years. He was, by my mother's accounting, the son who had stayed, the son who had shown up, the son who was there. What my mother did not account for, or chose not to, was the way presents can be used as currency. Raymond was there. That was true. He was also there in a way that required return on investment, though that vocabulary would never have been used on Calloway Street. I drove from Columbus to Harefield on the 2nd Sunday of every month for 14 years to help my parents with the house. I repainted the exterior in the summer of 2009, working 3 consecutive weekends while Raymond was at a sales conference in Scottsdale. I repaired the back porch railing in the spring of 2012, replacing 4 rotted posts and resealing the deck boards. I drove my father to his cardiology appointments at Harefield General every Thursday morning for 2 years and 3 months, beginning in January 2016, when Drive Paul Wentworth, his cardiologist, determined that my father should not be driving himself due to a developing arrhythmia. I waited in the same waiting room chair each time, the one nearest the window with a loose armrest, and I drove him home and made sure he took his afternoon medication before I got back in the car for Columbus. I paid the balance on my parents' property tax in 2014, the year the furnace failed and the repair bill left them short. $1,420. I did not mention it again. I hired and supervised the contractors who re-roofed the house in the fall of 2017. 2 weeks of phone calls and site visits and invoices, managed from Columbus, while Raymond told my mother he would have helped, but it was a busy quarter. The roof cost $11,000. My parents paid what they could. I covered the remaining $6,400 without discussion. My father knew all of this. Not because I kept a ledger, I did not, but because Edmund Marsh was a civil engineer who understood the difference between a load-bearing wall and decoration, and he applied that same discernment to people. He was quiet about it. He was always quiet about it. But he knew. In the spring of 2020, 5 months after Carol died, my father had a long conversation with Gerald Holloway, his estate attorney, whose office was on the 3rd floor of the Harrifield Professional Building on Maple Avenue. My father had been a client of Holloway's since 1994. I did not know about this conversation at the time. I learned about it later, and I will tell you when. What I did know in the spring of 2020 was that my father had given me something. He had handed it to me on a Tuesday afternoon in April in the kitchen on Calloway Street, while my mother was at her sister's house and Raymond was at work. He handed me a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. Block letters, the kind he used on engineering documents, precise and unhurried. He said, "Keep this somewhere you won't lose it. Don't open it while I'm still here." His voice was level. His hands were steady. I said, "All right, Dad." He nodded and poured himself a glass of water, and that was the end of it. I drove back to Columbus that evening with the envelope in my jacket pocket. I transferred it, when I got home, to the fireproof document box I kept on the shelf above my desk. The box was gray metal with a black handle. Carol had bought it in 2003 after a neighbor's house fire. It held our wills, the car titles, the deed to our house, and now, my father's envelope. My father died on March 8, 2022. He went into sleep at 11:14 p.m., according to the paramedics who were called by my mother at approximately 11:30. Raymond called me at 12:07 a.m. His voice was flat. He said, "Dad's gone." I said, "I'll be there by 6. I drove through the dark on an empty interstate and arrived at the house on Calloway Street at 5:58 a.m. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The 2 burned-out bulbs in the chandelier over the dining room were still burned out. The weeks after my father's funeral had a texture to them that I struggled to describe accurately. The house on Calloway Street felt smaller in his absence. The way rooms shrink when the person who inhabited them is gone. The carpet smell was stronger. The basement dampness rose. My mother moved to the kitchen in a way that suggested she was looking for something she could not name. Raymond, by the end of the first week, had begun to move through the house in a different way entirely, with a kind of ownership that was new and that I noticed and said nothing about. He sat at the head of the table at dinner, which had been my father's seat. He handled the incoming mail. He spoke to my mother's neighbors as though he were the responsible party. On the Thursday after the funeral, I was helping my mother sort through my father's papers in the study. The study was a small room off the hallway, wood-paneled, with a metal desk and 2 filing cabinets and a window that looked out onto the side yard. The light was gray and flat. The room smelled of old paper and particular mineral scent of filing cabinet metal. Raymond came to the doorway and stood there with his coffee mug and said, "I've been talking to Mom about the house." I said, "What about it?" He said, "She can't manage it alone. We've been thinking it would make more sense for me and Diane to move in, handle things from here." I said, "That sounds like something she should decide." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "She already has. I'm just letting you know." He left the doorway. My throat tightened just slightly, and I turned back to the filing cabinet and continued sorting. That was the first exchange. There would be many more. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother called me on a Sunday evening. The call came in at 7:22 p.m. She said she wanted to talk about the estate. I said I would come the following weekend. She said there was no need. Gerald Holloway had already been out to the house. I asked when. She said the previous Thursday. I asked if I was included in those conversations. She said, Raymond handles the logistics. You know how he is with details. I said nothing. I drove to Harefield the following Saturday. The drive from Columbus is 2 hours and 11 minutes on a clear day. I had made it so many times that I no longer noticed the landmarks. The house looked the same from the outside. Raymond's car was in the driveway. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls that Diane, Raymond's wife, had brought. Diane was pleasant in the way of someone who has been briefed on how to be pleasant. She handed me a mug and smiled and said, "It's so good you could make it." The cinnamon rolls were in a box from a bakery downtown. Raymond was at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He said, "Mom and I have been going through the financials." I said, "I see." He said, "The house is worth around $280. There's a small savings account. The pension payments ended with Dad, obviously." He paused. "We think it makes the most sense for this state to stay consolidated for now. Mom needs stability." I said, "What does that mean, consolidated?" He looked at Diane. Then he looked back at me. He said, "It means we think the house should stay in the family, here, where it can be managed, rather than going through probate and getting divided up. You understand?" I said, "I understand what you're saying." My mother was sitting at the far end of the kitchen, near the window. She said, without looking up from her coffee, "Raymond has been such a support. He's been here every day." Something in me went very still. I put my mug down on the counter and looked at the side yard to the window and thought about the $11,000 and the 2 years of cardiology appointments and the $1,420 in property tax, and I let the moment pass without giving it any weight that anyone in the room could see. Raymond said, "We're not trying to cut you out. You live in Columbus. You have your life. We just think it makes practical sense to have someone here." I said, "Of course." Over the following 6 weeks, the conversations became more direct. I drove to Harefield 4 more times. The tone shifted incrementally. On my 3rd visit, in late April, Raymond met me at the door before I could ring the bell. He said, "Mom's resting. You should have called." I said I had texted that morning. He said, "She doesn't always see those." My mother came to the door behind him. She looked smaller than I remembered. She said, "Gerald, come in." Her voice was tired. Raymond stepped back, but did not move fully out of the doorway. At dinner that evening, Raymond said, "We've been talking to Calloway about simplifying things, making sure there's no confusion about the property going forward." I said, "What kind of simplification?" He said, "A transfer. Mom wants to put the house in my name while she's still here. Avoid the probate process. Calloway says it's straightforward." The light in the dining room came from the same fixture with the 2 burned-out bulbs. Something in my chest went so, still it felt like suspension. I looked at the tablecloth and said nothing. My mother said, "It just makes sense, Gerald. Raymond is here." Raymond said, "You've got your own house. You've got Carol's life insurance. You're not exactly struggling." I said, "I see." Diane said, "We want what's best for everyone." Raymond said, "It's already in motion. Calloway filed the paperwork last week. Mom signed." My breath caught and then settled. I picked up my fork. I looked at the tablecloth, the same yellow tablecloth with the small embroidered flowers that had been on that table since 1979, and I thought about the envelope in the fireproof box on the shelf above my desk in Columbus. I thought about my father's handwriting, block letters, precise and unhurried. I said, "All right." Raymond said, "Don't make this into something it isn't." I said, "I'm not." He said, "You've always done this. You've always made everything harder than it needs to be. You've always been the difficult one, Gerald. This family works better when you let things go." I did not answer. I nodded once, in the way of a man who has heard something and registered it fully. My hands were very still on the table. My mother said, "I just want some peace. Is that so much to ask?" Raymond said, "She's right. You're upsetting her." I said, "I'm going to use the restroom." I walked down the hallway. The hallway smelled of carpet and the particular cold that comes from a house that isn't heated as much as it used to be. The certificate my father had received at his retirement hung on the wall, slightly crooked. I straightened it as I passed. In the small bathroom at the end of the hall, I ran cold water over my hands and looked at the mirror. My eyes stung. I let the water run for a moment. Then I turned it off. I dried my hands. I walked back down the hallway and returned to the table. I stayed for 1 more hour. I helped my mother with the dishes. I said goodbye to Raymond and Diane. I drove back to Columbus in the dark. At 9:47 p.m., approximately 90 minutes into the drive, I called Dr. Louise Tamura, my physician, to reschedule a routine appointment I had missed during the worst of the grief months. She was not available, obviously, but I left a message. I needed something ordinary to do with my hands, and making that call was the most ordinary thing I could think of. The envelope was exactly where I had left it. I sat at my desk at 6:14 a.m. on a Sunday morning in early May. The study in my Columbus house on Fenwood Drive was quiet at that hour. The street outside was empty. The neighbor's dog had not yet started its morning routine, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. The desk lamp was on. The window was gray with early light. Carol had put a small succulent on the windowsill in 2017, and I had kept it alive since she died, watering it every other Sunday, which is more consistency than I had managed with most things in my life over the previous 2.5 years. The fireproof box was on the desk in front of me, the gray metal, the black handle. I had not opened the envelope. My father had said not to open it while he was alive, and I had not. After he died, I had not opened it because there had been no reason to. I had trusted that I would know when the reason arrived. Sitting at my desk at 6:14 a.m. on a Sunday morning in May, with the knowledge that my brother had filed a property transfer without telling me and my mother had signed it, I understood that the reason had arrived, but I did not open it yet. I sat with it. I thought about my father at the dining room table. He had a particular way of listening. Entirely still, hands flat on the table, eyes on whoever was speaking. He never interrupted. He never countered in the moment. He waited until the full picture was clear before he said a single word. And when he said it, it meant something because he had earned it through patience. He had tried to teach me this. I was not always a good student, but I had learned enough. I thought about the cardiology appointments. 2 years and 3 months. Every Thursday morning. Dr. Paul Wentworth had told me, in the waiting room one Tuesday in September 2017, the appointment had been moved, unusually, to a Tuesday, that my father's heart condition was stable but would require ongoing monitoring, and that he was grateful someone was bringing him in consistently. He said, a lot of patients this age don't have that kind of support. I said, he's my father. He nodded. That was the whole conversation. I thought about the roof. I thought about the property tax. I thought about the morning I had arrived at 5:58 a.m. to find my mother sitting with the untouched tea, and the way she had looked at me when I walked through the door, not with relief, exactly, but with something that functioned like it. That look had receded over the 2 months since the funeral. Something had replaced it that I did not have a precise word for. Something careful and managed. I thought about what Raymond had said at the dinner table. You've always been the difficult one. This family works better without you in it. I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life. Not always those words, but that meaning, delivered in tones ranging from mild disappointment to frank dismissal. I had spent a significant portion of my life adjusting my behavior in response to it, moderating my presence, making myself smaller in that house. And for the first time, sitting at my desk on Fenwick Drive, I understood clearly that the adjusting had been a mistake, not because it had made things worse. It had made things perfectly comfortable for everyone who preferred that I be smaller, but because smallness had been mistaken for consent. I had not consented. At 7:03 a.m., I picked up the phone and called Gerald R. Holloway's office. His voicemail answered. I said my name. I said I was Edmund Marsh's son, the elder son, Gerald. I said I would like to schedule an appointment at his earliest convenience. I said it was regarding my father's estate, and that I had documentation I believe would be relevant to our conversation. I left my number. I hung up. Then I opened the envelope. My father's handwriting filled 2 pages. Block letters. Slightly smaller than his usual drafting hand, but the same precision. The date at the top was April 14th, 2020. I read it through once. Then I sat for a while. Then I read it again. My hands were completely still. My chest was so quiet I could feel my own heartbeat against my ribs. I placed the pages carefully back into the envelope. I picked up my phone again and took photographs of both pages. I emailed the photographs to myself and then printed them on the printer beside the desk. I placed the originals back in the fireproof box and the copies in a manila folder, which I labeled with a date and placed on the left side of my desk. Then I went to the kitchen and made coffee. The succulent on the windowsill needed water. I watered it. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched the Sunday morning light come into the yard and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. I still had work to do. 3 weeks after Carol died, in December 2019, I had begun volunteering 2 mornings a week at a housing advocacy nonprofit in Columbus, an organization called Fenwick Community Trust, doing structural assessments of low-income rental properties. I had continued through everything. I went the following Tuesday morning, the same as always. I signed in at 8 a.m. I took the site inspection clipboard from the hook by the door. That steadiness was not nothing. Gerald Holloway called me back on a Monday morning at 8:44 a.m. His voice was careful in the way of a man who has just understood that a conversation he thought was finished is not, in fact, finished. He said, "Mr. Marsh, thank you for reaching out." I said, "Thank you for returning my call." He said, "You mentioned documentation." I said, "Yes, I'd like to come in." He said, "I have Thursday at 2. I said, "I'll be there." I drove to Harefield on Thursday. The Harefield Professional Building on Maple Avenue was a 4-story brick structure built in the 1960s, with a small lobby and a slow elevator and carpet in the hallways the color of old mustard. Holloway's office was on the 3rd floor. I had been there once before, years earlier, when Carol and I had updated our own wills. The receptionist was the same woman, Mrs. Brenda Fisk, according to the nameplate, and she showed me into a conference room with a long table and windows that looked out over the parking lot. Gerald R. Holloway came in at 2:06 p.m. He was a man in his late 60s with careful eyes and the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where things were being decided. He sat across from me. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "What can I help you with, Mr. Marsh?" I placed a manila folder on the table between us. I said, "My father gave me this in April of 2020. I believe it's relevant to the estate proceedings." He looked at the folder. He did not touch it immediately. He said, "May I ask what it contains?" I said, "My father's handwritten description of his intentions regarding the property on Calloway Street, and a reference to a document he asked you to hold." Something in Holloway's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but I had spent 30 years in rooms where things were being negotiated, and I knew the shift. His hands, which had been folded on the table, went very still. He said, "Your father did leave certain instructions with this office." I said, "I suspected he had." He said, "The transfer your brother filed with your mother's signature, that is a matter on record with the county. I should be transparent with you. I was not the attorney who prepared that document." I said, "I understand." He said, "What your father left with this office is a separate matter." I said, "Yes, I believe it is." He excused himself for 11 minutes. I sat at the conference table and looked out at the parking lot. A woman was loading grocery bags into a hatchback. 2 pigeons were on the roof of the adjacent building. The afternoon was bright and cool and completely ordinary. Something in me was very still in the way of a room before a window is opened. Holloway came back with a second envelope, larger than the one my father had given me, manila, sealed with his firm's notary stamp. He sat down. He placed it on the table between us. He said, "Your father executed a trust document in April of 2020. He named you as trustee. The property on Calloway Street is an asset of that trust." I said nothing. He said, "The transfer your mother signed in April of this year was for the deed as your mother understood it to be titled. However, the deed had been moved into the trust in 2020. Your mother, I believe in good faith, signed a document that legally could not transfer what purported to transfer." I said, "Because she no longer had sole title." He said, "Correct." I said, "Does Raymond know?" Holloway said, I do not believe he does. I drove home with the sealed envelope on the passenger seat. I did not open it in the parking lot. I drove back to Fenwick Drive and sat in my driveway for a moment with the engine off. The neighborhood was quiet. The maple tree at the end of the block had gone fully green. A cardinal was in the branches, and I watched it for a while. Over the following 3 weeks, Raymond called me twice. Both calls were brief and had the texture of monitoring, checking to see if I knew anything, without asking directly if I knew anything. On the first call, he said, "Mom wants to know if you're coming for Mother's Day." I said, "Tell her I'll be there." On the second call, 8 days later, he said, "Holloway says the transfer is almost fully processed." He paused as though waiting for a reaction. I said, "I see." He said, "You're not going to make this into a thing, are you?" I said, "Raymond, I'll see you on Mother's Day." Raymond had, by this point, begun renovating the upstairs bathroom on Calloway Street. He had hired a contractor, a man named Phil Borden, according to the invoice my mother mentioned, and the work had begun in the first week of May. Raymond had also mentioned, on the second phone call, that he and Diane were planning to list their own house once the transfer was complete and the timing was right. He said this casually, the way a man says something he wants recorded but does not want to call attention to. I said, "That makes sense." He said, "It does." Meanwhile, I had contacted Marcus Webb, a property and trust attorney in Columbus with offices on High Street, who had been recommended to me by a colleague at Fenwick Community Trust. On May 17th at 10:15 a.m., Marcus Webb submitted a formal legal inquiry to the Hereford County Recorder's Office regarding the status of the Calloway Street deed and the trust instrument executed in April 2020. The inquiry was routine, procedural, and completely invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. I continued going to Fenwick Community Trust on Tuesday mornings. I continued making the drive to Hereford on the second Sunday of each month. I sat at the table in the dining room under the chandelier with the 2 burned-out bulbs and ate whatever my mother had made and listened to Raymond talk about the bathroom renovation and said very little. My mother seemed settled. Raymond seemed confident. Diane refilled everyone's coffee without being asked, which is what pleasant people do when they are trying not to seem complicit. The Tuesday after Mother's Day, Marcus Webb called me at 9:20 a.m. He said, "The trust is clean. The county recording confirms it. Your father executed it correctly in April of 2020, properly notarized, properly filed. The property was in trust when your mother signed the transfer document. The transfer has no legal force." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "That depends on what you like to do." I said, "Set up a meeting." Mother's Day had passed quietly. The Sunday after Memorial Day was when I drove to Hereford with a manila envelope from Holloway's office and a copy of Marcus Webb's formal correspondence. Raymond's car was in the driveway. Diane's car was beside it. A contractor's van I did not recognize was parked at the curb. The house smelled of fresh paint and sawdust from the upstairs work. My mother was in the kitchen with coffee. Raymond was at the table with his legal pad. Diane was washing something at the sink. The May afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and made the yellow tablecloth look almost gold. Raymond said, "We weren't expecting you." I said, "I know. I want to talk to all of you together." He said, "This isn't a great time. Phil's upstairs working." I said, "This won't take long." I set the folder on the table. I sat down across from Raymond. My voice was level. My hands were flat on the table the way my father's always were. Raymond said, "What is that?" I said, "Dad left an envelope with Gerald Holloway's office in April of 2020. Holloway confirmed it to me in person on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks ago." Raymond looked at the folder. His face went still. I said, "Dad moved the Calloway Street property into a trust in April of 2020. The trust names me as trustee. The deed was in the trust when Mom signed the transfer document in April of this year." My mother said, "What?" I said, "The transfer has no legal force, Mom. The property was no longer titled in your name alone. It was in the trust. You can't transfer what you don't solely own." Raymond said, "That's not. Holloway told us the transfer was processing." I said, "Holloway told you a transfer had been filed." He did not tell you it would complete. I spoke with him in person. He confirmed the trust exists and is properly recorded. Raymond's hands were flat on the table. The color in his face had changed. Not dramatically, but the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves across the sun. I said, nothing more. I let that settle. My mother said, Edmund did this? I said, yes. He executed it properly. It was filed with the county. Marcus Webb, my attorney on High Street in Columbus, confirmed it last Tuesday morning. Diane turned from the sink. She was very still. Raymond said, you went behind our backs. I said, Dad made a legal arrangement in 2020. I found out about it when you filed a transfer for a property that wasn't solely yours to transfer. I didn't go behind anything. I read an envelope my father gave me, and I made a phone call. Raymond said, this is what you do. You always do this. You wait and you... He stopped. He looked at the folder on the table. Then he looked at me. Something in his expression moved through several stages very quickly, and what remained at the end of them was something flat and careful. My mother said, he left it to you. I said, he left it in the trust. I'm the trustee. That means I'm responsible for managing it in accordance with the trust terms. The trust terms are in the document. She said, what do the terms say? I said, that you have the right to live in the house for the remainder of your life. That after that, the property and any assets pass to your grandchildren equally. I paused. Not to Raymond. Not to me. To the grandchildren. The kitchen was completely quiet except for the sound of Phil working upstairs, a rhythmic scraping, the sound of tile being set or removed. Raymond said, the renovation. I said, the renovation was done without my authorization as trustee. That a matter between you and Marcus Webb. I picked up the folder. I stood up. I said, Mom, I'll call you Thursday. The house is yours to live in. Nothing about your daily life changes. I looked at her for a moment. Her eyes were wet. She was not looking at Raymond. I walked to the front door. I put on my jacket. I let myself out. In the driveway, the afternoon light was warm, and the maple trees on Calloway Street were in full leaf, the way they always were at the end of May. I got in my car. I pulled out of the driveway. At the end of the block, I turned left, the same turn I had made hundreds of times, heading toward the interstate. I drove home with the radio off. The road was clear. Marcus Webb filed the formal notice of trust to the Harefield County Recorder's office on June 3rd. The transfer Raymond and my mother had initiated was formally voided on June 11th. Raymond received written notice from Webb's office on June 14th, a Thursday, at 10:22 a.m., according to the certified mail receipt. Phil Borden, the contractor, submitted his final invoice for the bathroom renovation on June 5th. Raymond paid it. The question of reimbursement from trust assets was a matter that Webb and I discussed and ultimately declined to pursue, primarily because my mother had been living in the house and had benefited from the renovation, and because making it a legal matter would have extended things in a direction I had no interest in. Raymond called me once after the notice. It was a short call. He said, I want you to know I think what you did was wrong. I said, I know you do. He said, Dad would have wanted this handled differently. I said, Dad handled it himself, Raymond, in April of 2020. The call ended shortly after that. My mother and I spoke on the phone every Thursday, as I had said we would. The calls were quiet and not quite easy, but they were honest in a way they had not always been. She said in the third week of June, I didn't know he had done that. I said, I know. She said, he was always very quiet about things. I said, yes. She said, he trusted you. I said, I know he did. The line was still for a moment. Then she said, come for dinner on Sunday. I said I would. I drove to Harefield on that Sunday. Raymond was not there. The kitchen smelled of pot roast and the old carpet and the familiar dampness. The chandelier over the dining room still had 2 burned-out bulbs. I went to the small supply closet in the hallway and found the bulbs my father had always kept there, a neat row of them on the second shelf, the same brand he had bought for 30 years. I replaced both bulbs. My mother watched from the doorway. She said, he kept buying those and never putting them in. I said, I know. She said, why do you think he did that? I said, "I don't know. Maybe he knew someone would." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen. Edmund Marsh had been an engineer. He understood load-bearing walls. He understood that what keeps a structure standing is not always visible from the outside, and that the person doing the invisible work is not always the person with their name on the plans. He had also understood that a man who waits quietly while others make noise is not a man who has accepted what is being done to him. He is a man who is building something they cannot see. There is a difference between being overlooked and being unseen. The people who overlooked me had convinced themselves those were the same thing. My father knew they were not. He had spent 2 years in a cardiologist's waiting room with me confirm what he already knew, and then he had done something about it in the only way that mattered. Precisely, quietly, with his handwriting on 2 pages and a notary seal on a manila envelope, filed correctly with the county before anyone thought to check. Gerald Marsh, 63 years old, and home in Columbus on a Sunday night with the lights on and the radio playing softly in the kitchen, and the succulent on the windowsill that had outlasted more than I had expected it to. My father kept buying the bulbs. I never asked why. He knew someone would put them in eventually. That was the whole of it, really. That was the whole difference between a man who builds and a man who claims. One of them keeps the supplies on the shelf. If you were sitting at that dinner table on Calloway Street, what would you have done in that moment when Raymond said the paperwork was already filed? Would you have spoken, or would you have said nothing and driven home to the envelope? Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.